Ayn Rand built one of the few complete philosophical systems of the 20th century. She called it Objectivism. It covers metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics and aesthetics. Each branch follows from the one before it, so the whole structure stands or falls together. Her novels have sold over 30 million copies. Her ideas have shaped political movements, business culture, and how millions of people understand their own lives. Yet professional philosophy has largely ignored her. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes that she is barely mentioned in entries on the topics she wrote about most. Egoism, rights, virtue ethics, capitalism. The reasons for this neglect are themselves part of the story, and we will get to them. But the neglect means most people encounter Rand either as a devotee or as a dismissal. They rarely encounter the actual arguments, reconstructed carefully and tested against the strongest objections. That is what this script does. We will reconstruct the full system from the ground up. Every major argument, every major objection, every serious defense. The goal is not to recruit and not to debunk. The goal is to make the structure visible so you can evaluate it yourself. Part 1. The System and its Ambition. Most philosophers today work on isolated problems. They publish papers on narrow questions within a single subfield. Rand did something different. She built a complete system where each branch depends on the ones beneath it. Metaphysics tells you what exists. Epistemology tells you how to know it. Ethics tells you what to do. Politics tells you how to organize a society. Aesthetics tells you what art is and why it matters. And the order is not arbitrary. You cannot know what to do until you know how to think. You cannot know how to think until you know what kind of reality you are thinking about. This top-down architecture is the first thing to understand about Rand. It means a crack in the foundation threatens the whole structure. If her metaphysics fails, everything above it is unsupported. If it holds, rejecting her ethics requires finding the exact point where the derivation breaks. She designed the system this way deliberately. She wanted a philosophy where you could not cherry-pick conclusions without accepting the premises that produce them. Why build such a thing at all? The biographical answer is brief but relevant. Rand grew up in Soviet Russia. She watched a society reorganize itself around a set of philosophical ideas, and she watched the result. Collectivism and dialectical materialism became state policy. Confiscation, censorship, and the crushing of individual judgment followed. Her family's pharmacy was seized by the state. She left for America in 1926 and never returned. But the lesson she drew was not merely political. She concluded that philosophy is the engine of history. Bad philosophy does not stay in the seminar room. It enters law, education, culture, and eventually the structure of daily life. A society that accepts the idea that individuals exist to serve the group will eventually build institutions that enforce that idea. A society that accepts the idea that reality is unknowable will eventually stop trusting reason and turn to authority or force. This is why Rand saw system building as urgent, not academic. She believed every person already operates on philosophical premises, whether they have examined them or not. You act as if reality is a certain way. You act as if knowledge is acquired by certain means. You act as if certain things matter and others do not. The question is not whether you have a philosophy. The question is whether yours is conscious and coherent or absorbed and contradictory. Rand's ambition was to make the conscious and coherent option available. She wanted to show that starting from a few basic observations about reality, you could derive a complete guide to living. Not floating rules handed down by tradition or feeling. A structure where every principle connects to every other principle, and all of them connect to observable facts. Whether she succeeded is the question this entire script is organized around. Part 2. Existence, Identity, Consciousness. Every argument starts from premises, but what justifies the premises themselves? Trace any chain of reasoning backward and you hit a wall. Either the chain goes on forever, which means nothing is grounded, or it circles back to itself, which means you assumed what you set out to prove, or it stops at something that does not itself need proof. Rand takes the third option. She identifies 3 axioms, starting points that cannot be denied without being used in the denial. The first is that existence exists. Something is. This sounds trivially obvious, and Rand would agree that it should. The point is not that the claim is surprising, but that it cannot be escaped. To say nothing exists, you must exist to say it. To doubt that anything is real, you must be real to do the doubting. The second axiom is consciousness. You are aware of something. Consciousness for Rand is not a thing floating in space. It is the faculty of perceiving that which exists. It cannot exist without something to be conscious of, and existence cannot be known without some consciousness doing the knowing. The two are correlatives. Neither is reducible to the other, and neither is prior to the other in the order of reality. The third axiom is identity. To exist is to be something in particular. A thing is what it is. It has specific attributes, specific properties, and acts in accordance with its nature. This is Rand's version of the classical law of identity, applied not just to logic, but to reality itself. A rock does what a rock does because of what a rock is. An atom behaves according to its nature. There are no exceptions, no moments when a thing acts outside its identity. From identity, Rand derives causality. If a thing must be what it is, then it must act as what it is. Causality is not a separate law imposed on entities from outside. It is the law of identity applied to action. Fire burns because of what fire is. Water freezes because of what water is. To deny causality would be to say a thing can act against its own nature. That would mean it is not what it is, which contradicts identity. Rand does not claim to prove these axioms. She claims you cannot prove them because proof already presupposes them. Any proof uses concepts. Concepts refer to things that exist. Using concepts already assumes existence, consciousness, and identity. Arguing against any axiom requires relying on that very axiom in the act of arguing. Rand calls this error the fallacy of the stolen concept. It means using an idea while denying the foundations that make the idea possible. Consider a skeptic who says we cannot know anything about reality. To make this claim, the skeptic must know at least one thing about reality, namely that it is unknowable. The claim devours itself. The skeptic has stolen the concept of knowledge, used it to make an assertion, then denied that knowledge is possible. This leads to what Rand considers her most important metaphysical principle. She called it the primacy of existence. Reality is what it is independent of anyone's beliefs, wishes, feelings, or consciousness. Consciousness does not create reality. It perceives reality. Wishing does not make something so. The world was here before anyone was aware of it. It operates according to its own nature, whether anyone observes it or not. The alternative, which Rand calls the primacy of consciousness, holds that reality is somehow shaped or constituted by the mind. She sees this as the root error of most Western philosophy after Plato. In religion, it takes the form of a divine mind, whose will creates the world. In idealism, consciousness structures the conditions of experience. In subjectivism, individual feeling or collective agreement decides what is real or true. Rand rejects all three versions. For Rand, the primacy of existence is not one option among many. It is the precondition of rational thought itself. If consciousness creates or shapes reality, then there are no objective facts to discover. Inquiry becomes pointless because the answer changes depending on who is asking. Science becomes impossible because nature has no fixed character to investigate. Even logic becomes unreliable because the laws of identity would be subject to the mind. This is the foundation of Rand's entire system. Everything that follows, her theory of concepts, her ethics, her politics, rests on one claim. Reality is objective and knowable. Consciousness is a tool of awareness, not a tool of creation. Things are what they are, regardless of what anyone wants them to be. If this foundation holds, the system has ground to stand on. If it does not, nothing built on it is secure. Part 3. The War on Kant. Rand reserved a special hostility for one philosopher above all others. Not Marx, whose politics she despised, but whose philosophy she considered derivative. The target was Immanuel Kant. She called him the most evil man in history. That claim startles anyone who knows Kant as a mild professor in Königsberg who wrote about moral duty. To understand why Rand said this, you have to understand what she thought Kant did to philosophy. Kant's central move in the critique of pure reason was to distinguish two layers of reality. There are things as they appear to us, the phenomenal world. And there are things as they are in themselves, the noumenal world. The world of experience is structured by the human mind. Space, time, and causality are not features of reality as it exists independently. They are forms that our cognition imposes on raw sensory input. Behind appearances lies the noumenal world, things as they really are. And that world, Kant argued, is forever inaccessible to human knowledge. For Rand, this was catastrophic. She read Kant as saying the mind does not perceive reality, but builds a barrier between itself and reality. The very faculties that should give us knowledge are the things that cut us off from the world as it is. The better you think, the further you get from truth. Every act of cognition adds another layer of mental distortion. This is what Rand meant by the primacy of consciousness in its most sophisticated form. Kant did not say that individuals create reality through wishing or feeling. He said something subtler, and Rand believed more dangerous. He said the structure of human cognition determines the structure of human experience. We can never compare our experience to mind-independent reality. We are permanently locked inside the processing of our own faculties. Rand thought the consequences rippled through everything that followed. If reason cannot reach reality, then reason loses its authority. And if reason loses its authority, something must replace it. Faith, feeling, tradition, collective consensus, the will of the state. Rand traced the irrationalism of the 19th and 20th centuries back to the door Kant opened. From Hegel to Marx to the pragmatists, she saw a single thread. Kant did not intend most of these consequences, but Rand argued that philosophical ideas have a logic that outlives their author's intentions. There is a genuine question about whether Rand read Kant fairly. Most Kant scholars would say she did not. Kant did not believe he had destroyed knowledge. He believed he had saved it by showing its proper limits and conditions. The categories of the understanding, on Kant's own account, make objective experience possible. Without them, there would be no structured world of experience at all, just a chaotic wash of sensation. Kant also argued that the noumenal realm, though beyond theoretical reason, is accessible through practical reason. His ethics, grounded in the categorical imperative, was meant as a triumph of reason in the moral domain. Most Kant scholars view Rand's portrait of him as an enemy of reason as a serious misreading. They argue she mistakes a theory of the conditions of knowledge for a denial of knowledge. Defenders of Rand's reading, particularly Leonard Peikoff, argue that the mainstream interpretation misses the damage. The point is not what Kant intended, but what his framework implies. If the mind contributes the structure of experience, then what we call knowledge is always knowledge of appearances, never knowledge of the world as it is in itself. That gap, however carefully Kant managed it, opens the door to every subsequent claim that reality is unknowable. Peikoff argues that Kant's careful distinctions were quickly abandoned by his successors. They took the lesson to be that the mind makes its own world. This debate matters because Rand's entire epistemology is built as an answer to what she saw as the Kantian disaster. Her theory of concepts is designed to show that the mind does not distort reality through knowing it. It grasps reality. The mind's processing is not a barrier, but a means of access. Whether that alternative succeeds depends on the details of her theory of concept formation, and those details are where Rand's epistemology becomes genuinely original. Part 4. Concepts as Measurement. Here is a problem that has haunted philosophy since the Greeks. You see one table, then another, then another. They differ in size, shape, material, colour, and weight. Yet you call them all tables. What makes that word apply to all of them? What is the same thing across these different objects that justifies grouping them under one concept? The traditional answers split into camps. Plato said there is a form of table, an abstract perfect table in a separate realm. Each physical table participates in the form. Aristotle brought the universal down into the particular, placing the form inside the thing itself. Nominalists said there is nothing real that all tables share. The word table is just a label we apply for practical convenience. Conceptualists said the universal exists only in the mind, as a mental abstraction. Each answer has well-known problems. Plato's forms require a mysterious separate realm and an equally mysterious relation of participation. Aristotle's immanent universals raise the question of how one thing can be present in many objects at once. Nominalism cannot explain why some groupings track reality and others do not. Conceptualism makes universals mental, which threatens to make knowledge subjective. Rand proposed a different answer. It is arguably the most original idea in her entire philosophy. She called it measurement omission. The theory runs like this. You perceive several objects, say several tables. They are similar in certain respects, but differ in their specific measurements. They all have flat surfaces supported by legs, but the surfaces vary in length, width, and height. To form the concept table, you identify what these objects have in common. Not an identical property shared by all, but a commensurable attribute. A commensurable attribute is a characteristic they all possess, but in different amounts or degrees. Length is something all tables have, but the specific length varies from table to table. Concept formation, according to Rand, consists of retaining the attribute while omitting the specific measurements. You keep the fact that tables have length, width, height, and a flat supported surface. You drop the specific numbers. The concept then refers to any concrete object with those attributes, measurements unspecified but understood to exist. Table does not refer to an abstract form. It refers to any object with a flat supported surface within the range of measurements that distinguish it from a shelf or a bench. The omitted measurements are not erased from reality. They remain in every particular table. The concept simply does not specify which measurement any given table has. A key element is what Rand called the conceptual common denominator. Before you can compare objects, you need a dimension along which they can be compared. You cannot compare a colour with a shape, but you can compare two shapes because shape is the shared dimension of variation. The conceptual common denominator is that shared dimension. Two tables can be compared along the dimension of surface area, even if one is 3 times larger. The concept integrates them by retaining the dimension and omitting the particular value. Rand understood measurement broadly, to include ordinal and not only cardinal relationships. This means the theory covers more than quantities you can assign numbers to. Colours can be ordered by wavelength. Emotional intensities can be ordered by degree without precise units. This broader sense of measurement is what allows the theory to cover all concepts, not just physical ones. What does this gain you? Rand argued it solves the problem of universals without invoking separate realms or purely mental constructions. Concepts on her account are objective. They are not intrinsic features of reality independent of the mind, as Plato held. They are not subjective inventions with no connection to reality, as certain nominalists suggest. They result from a specific cognitive process applied to real similarities among particular things. The similarity is real because the commensurable attributes are real. Tables really do have flat surfaces and supporting structures. But the concept is a product of cognitive method because the mind performs the act of omitting measurements. No concept floats in a Platonic heaven. No concept is a mere verbal tag attached arbitrarily to things. There are serious objections. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes that Rand says little about the metaphysical status of the similarity she relies on. Her insistence that everything in reality is particular raises a question she does not fully answer. If there are no universals in the world, what grounds the commensurability that makes measurement omission possible? Two tables can be compared along the dimension of length only if length is something genuinely shared. But what is that shared something, if not a universal? Rand's theory handles what philosophers call generic identity across specific difference well. That is how red applies to different shades of red. But it says less about specific identity across numerical difference. That is how one exact shade of red applies to two separate objects. Critics argue the deeper problem of universals reappears where Rand's theory goes silent. Some also note that her distinction between the form and content of awareness resembles the Kantian framework she meant to replace. Defenders respond that Rand never denied that particular things have real attributes. The commensurability is not a universal hovering above particulars. It is a relationship among particular attributes that really exist in particular things. Harry Binswanger has argued that measurement omission is really measurement inclusion. The concept retains the full range of measurement values, not some ghostly property stripped of specificity. Whether this fully resolves the difficulty is an open question in the scholarship. The theory of measurement omission remains Rand's most technically ambitious philosophical contribution. It is the part of her work most likely to reward careful engagement regardless of where one ends up. Part 5. Certainty, the Analytic-Synthetic distinction, and the problem of knowledge. A standard move in modern philosophy divides all truths into two kinds. Analytic truths are true by definition. All bachelors are unmarried is true because bachelor already contains unmarried. Synthetic truths are true because of how the world happens to be. Some bachelors are unhappy is a claim about reality that could have been otherwise. This distinction, tracing back through Kant to Hume and Leibniz, shapes how most philosophers think about knowledge. Rand, through an argument developed in detail by Leonard Peikoff, rejected the distinction entirely. The argument begins with a question about what concepts contain. The analytic-synthetic distinction assumes a concept's meaning is fixed by its definition, and a definition captures only some of a thing's properties. Bachelor means unmarried man, and that is all the concept analytically contains. Anything else true about bachelors, that they have mass, that some are left-handed, is synthetic. It goes beyond the definition. But this assumes a specific theory of concepts, one where a definition exhausts the concept's content. On Rand's theory, it does not. A concept formed by measurement omission refers to all the attributes of the entities it subsumes, not only those captured in the definition. The definition identifies the essential distinguishing characteristics, the features that differentiate this group from others. But the concept integrates everything that the entities are. If that is right, then the analytic-synthetic split collapses. There is no principled line between truths contained in the definition and truths that go beyond it. Bachelors are unmarried and bachelors have mass are both true in virtue of what bachelors actually are. The first is identified by the definition. The second is not, but both are part of what the concept refers to. The stakes are high. If the analytic-synthetic distinction holds, necessary truths are merely verbal. All truths about reality become contingent, revisable, and never fully certain. Rand and Peikoff see this as a slow-acting poison in modern philosophy. It means nothing you learn about the world can ever be known with certainty. All knowledge of reality is synthetic, and therefore could in principle be overturned. You can be certain that bachelors are unmarried. You can never be certain about anything that actually matters. Rand's alternative is what she called contextual certainty. Knowledge is always held in a context, the total of the evidence available and the integrations made so far. Within that context, you can be genuinely certain, not infallible. Not omniscient, but rationally certain that your conclusion follows from the evidence you have. New evidence can expand the context and require new integrations, but that does not mean your previous conclusions were wrong. They were correct within their context. A wider context now reveals more. Rand also made a distinctive move regarding claims that lack any evidential basis. She classified the arbitrary as outside cognition entirely. An arbitrary assertion, a claim with no connection to evidence or reasoning, is not false. It is not even worth evaluating. There might be an undetectable dragon in my garage is not a proposition that reason needs to take seriously. It does not enter the field of knowledge and does not require refutation. The burden of proof falls on whoever makes a claim. A claim backed by nothing is simply dismissed. This has real consequences for how objectivists approach a range of debates. Skeptical scenarios, from Descartes' evil demon to the simulation hypothesis, are classified as arbitrary. They are therefore cognitively empty on Rand's account. Theistic claims without evidence receive the same treatment. They are not engaged as live alternatives requiring elaborate counter-argument. They are set aside as outside the domain of rational discussion. Critics note several difficulties. The rejection of the analytic-synthetic distinction remains controversial even among Rand's sympathizers. Many philosophers accept some version of the distinction without accepting the theory of concepts Rand attributed to its defenders. Quine also attacked the distinction from very different premises, and the resulting debate is far from settled. And contextual certainty, while appealing, faces the challenge of specifying when a context is adequate. Rand's answer, that you go by the total evidence you have, is reasonable. But it may underestimate how difficult it is to know whether your evidence is sufficient. Part 6. Volition. Rand's ethics depends on a claim that most of modern science and much of modern philosophy would contest. The claim is that human beings have genuine free will. But Rand's version of free will is specific and unusual. It differs from most positions in the traditional debate. Start with the problem. If everything that happens is determined by prior causes, then your choices are also determined. Your decision to listen to this sentence was fixed by the state of your brain. That state was fixed by prior events stretching back to the beginning of the universe. The feeling of choosing is real, but the choosing itself is an illusion. You could not have done otherwise. This is hard determinism. If it is true, moral responsibility collapses. You cannot praise or blame someone for something they had no power to control. The traditional alternative is libertarian free will. It holds that some human choices are uncaused or self-caused, not determined by prior physical states. But this faces an obvious objection. If a choice is not caused by anything, it seems random, not free. Randomness is not agency. A will that operates outside the causal order looks less like freedom and more like a coin flip. Compatibilists try to split the difference by redefining freedom. You are free, they say, when you act from your own desires rather than from external compulsion, even if those desires were themselves determined. Rand rejected compatibilism explicitly. She regarded it as a verbal trick that redefines freedom while accepting the substance of determinism. Rand's own position centers on a single claim. The primary act of free will is the choice to focus your mind or not. This is not a choice among actions or a choice among desires. It is the choice to engage your rational faculty or to let it drift. In any moment, you can direct your awareness toward reality, activating your full capacity to think. Or you can let your attention blur, evade what you know, and follow impulse without examination. This choice, Rand argued, is irreducible. It is not caused by prior mental states, because prior mental states are products of earlier choices to focus or not. It is not random, because it is an act performed by a conscious agent for whom awareness is always available. It is the one point in the causal chain where the agent is a first cause with respect to their own cognitive process. Rand treated this as self-evident. She did not think it could be or needed to be proved by more basic premises. You know you can choose to think because you are doing it right now, or choosing not to. Any argument against free will presupposes the arguer's ability to focus, evaluate evidence, and follow logic. Those are exercises of the very faculty whose freedom is being denied. Determinism, on this account, is self-refuting. A determinist who claims to have reasoned their way to determinism must have freely directed their mind to reason. This argument has real force, but it also has real problems. Neuroscience has accumulated evidence that conscious decision-making is preceded by unconscious neural activity. The Libet experiments and their successors suggest the brain begins preparing an action before the subject reports deciding. Whether these findings actually refute free will is debated. The experiments involve simple motor tasks and may not generalize to complex reasoning, but they put pressure on any view that treats conscious choice as an uncause first cause. Philosophers of mind also question whether self-evident is doing too much work here. Many things that feel self-evident turn out to be false or more complicated than introspection suggests. The feeling of choosing may be a real phenomenon without being evidence that the choice is genuinely undetermined. Rand's defenders argue the alternative is worse. Denying volition undermines the very possibility of rational evaluation. That undermines any argument, including the argument against free will. This is a powerful dialectical point, but opponents ask whether it proves volition exists as Rand described it. Perhaps it only proves that we must assume something like volition for rational discourse to function. What matters for the rest of Rand's system is this. If the choice to think is free, then people are responsible for what they do with their minds. A person who evades reality, who refuses to think when thinking is possible, is morally accountable for that refusal. Ethics becomes possible because human action is not automatic. You have a choice, and the content of that choice, whether you direct your mind or let it drift, is the foundation of moral character. Every virtue Rand identifies will trace back to this single root, the choice to think. Part 7. The Bridge from Is to Ought. David Hume observed in 1739 that you cannot logically derive a statement about what ought to be from a statement about what is. No amount of factual information about the world tells you by itself what you should do. The sky is blue. Nothing follows about whether you should paint your house blue. Human beings need food to survive. Nothing follows without an additional premise about whether survival is good. This is the is-ought gap. It has been one of the central problems in moral philosophy for nearly 3 centuries. Most ethical theories accept the gap and deal with it in one of 2 ways. Either they posit a fundamental moral truth as a starting axiom, something you must accept before reasoning begins. Or they ground morality in something non-rational. Divine command, intuition, social agreement, or brute preference. Rand rejected all of these. She claimed to have derived ought from is, grounding ethics entirely in facts about reality. No arbitrary starting axioms, no appeal to non-rational sources. Her argument begins with a question. What kind of entity needs values at all? A rock does not need anything. It exists whether conditions are favourable or not. It does not face the alternative of existing or ceasing to exist in a way that depends on its own actions. It has no stake in anything. A living organism is different. A plant needs sunlight, water, and nutrients. If it gets them, it lives. If it does not, it dies. Life is conditional. It requires specific actions to sustain itself, and failure is permanent. This conditionality, Rand argued, is what makes the concept of value possible and necessary. A value is that which an organism acts to gain or keep in order to sustain its life. Without life, there is nothing for which anything could be good or bad. Goodness and badness enter the universe only when there is an entity that can succeed or fail at existing. Life is therefore not just one value among others. It is the value that makes all other values possible. It is the standard by which all other values are measured. This is the bridge. The concept of value is not imposed on reality by human feeling or divine command. It arises from a fact about certain entities, the fact that they are alive and that their continued existence depends on their actions. The is the biological nature of living organisms. The ought is the set of actions required by that nature for survival. If you want to live, then certain things are objectively required, and those requirements are discoverable by reason. Here is where the argument becomes genuinely controversial, and where the strongest objections land. Robert Nozick, in his 1971 essay on the Randian argument, identified a gap that many philosophers consider fatal. Grant everything Rand says about living organisms needing values to survive. Grant that the concept of value only arises in the context of life. Grant that if you choose to live, reason can tell you what to do. None of this shows that you ought to choose to live in the first place. The argument establishes a conditional. If you want to live, then you should do what life requires. But ethics is supposed to tell you what you should want. If the ultimate choice to live is outside the scope of ethical argument, the is-ought gap has not been closed. It has been pushed back one step. Rand has shown that values are grounded in life. She has not shown that choosing life is itself rationally required. Rand's defenders have offered several responses. One, developed by Tara Smith and others, argues the choice to live is implicit in any act of valuing. To ask, "Should I choose to live?" is already to be evaluating, and evaluation presupposes life as its context. You cannot rationally evaluate the choice to live from outside the project of living. Rationality itself is a life-sustaining activity. The question is therefore self-undermining, like the skeptic's denial of knowledge. Another response argues Rand was not trying to convince someone with no interest in living. Her ethics is addressed to anyone already alive and already choosing to act. For such a person, the question is not whether to live, but how. And the answer to that question is fully derivable from facts about human nature. Critics find neither response fully satisfying. Michael Humer has pressed a different objection, arguing that Rand equivocates between different meanings of life. Sometimes she seems to mean biological survival, the mere continuation of biological processes. Sometimes she means a distinctly human life of rational purpose and productive achievement. Sometimes she means flourishing, a life worth living. These three things can come apart. A person might survive biologically while living without any rational purpose. A person committed to rational purpose might sacrifice survival for a value they consider higher. If life shifts meaning at different points in the argument, then the conclusion does not follow cleanly from the premises. The move from biological survival to rational human flourishing requires additional steps that Rand did not always make explicit. Whether those steps can be filled in is one of the central unresolved questions in objectivist ethics. It is the question that defenders and critics are still actively arguing about. Part 8. Life as the standard of value. If life is the root of value, the next question is, what kind of life? Rand's answer is specific. The standard of value is not mere survival, not staying alive as long as possible by any means. The standard is what she called man's life qua man. This means the life proper to a human being, the kind of life a rational animal requires in order to function as a rational animal. The distinction matters because it rules out certain ways of surviving. A person who survives by fraud, theft, or parasitism on others is alive in a biological sense. But Rand would say that person is not living a human life in the relevant sense. They have abandoned the faculty that defines human existence, namely reason. They are surviving by means that contradict their nature. They are alive, but not living as a human being lives. This raises an obvious objection. Is Rand smuggling a normative ideal into what was supposed to be a factual description? To say a thief is not really living as a human sounds like a moral judgment dressed up as a biological one. The thief is plainly human and plainly alive. What Rand means is that certain ways of living are inconsistent with the long-term requirements of a rational being. Theft, fraud, and evasion may work in the short run, but they undermine the conditions that make human life possible on a larger scale. The connection to Aristotle is real and important, though Rand would have qualified it. Aristotle held that every living thing has a function, and that the good for a thing consists in performing its function well. The good life for a human being is one where the distinctively human capacity, reason, operates at its best. This is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or flourishing. Rand's man's life qua man is structurally similar. Both ground ethics in the nature of the organism rather than in commands, preferences, or social agreements. But Rand differs from Aristotle on several points. She is more individualist. Aristotle treated human beings as political animals whose flourishing is inseparable from community life. Rand treated human beings as individual rational agents whose primary relation to others is trade. She also rejected Aristotle's metaphysical biology, the idea that things have intrinsic final causes pulling them toward natural ends. For Rand, the requirements of human life are not teleological in the traditional sense. They are causal. A rational being needs certain conditions to function, just as an engine needs fuel. Ethics is the identification of those conditions. Rand drew a distinction between the standard of value and the purpose of ethics. The standard is man's life qua man, the objective measure for evaluating actions and goals. The purpose is the individual's own happiness. These are not the same thing, and the distinction is easily missed. The standard tells you how to evaluate choices. The purpose tells you what you're ultimately aiming at. Happiness, for Rand, is not pleasure. It is not a subjective feeling disconnected from achievement. It is the emotional state that results from achieving one's rational values. A person who builds a career, creates something meaningful, and loves honestly experiences happiness as a consequence. A person who chases whims, evades reality, and lives by deception will not achieve genuine happiness, even if they experience intermittent pleasure. From the Standard, Rand derived 3 cardinal values. Reason, because it is the primary means of survival for a rational being. Purpose, meaning the commitment to productive work as the central organizing principle of life. And self-esteem, the conviction that one is competent to live and worthy of living. Each corresponds to a central virtue, and we turn to those virtues now. Part 9. The Virtues of the Egoist. Rand identified 7 virtues, each derived from the requirements of human survival. These are not rules imposed from outside. They are the character traits a person needs in order to sustain their life through reason. Each virtue is a form of action, not a feeling or a disposition in the abstract. Each addresses a specific challenge a rational being faces in maintaining contact with reality. The primary virtue is rationality. Rand defined it as the recognition and acceptance of reason as one's only source of knowledge and guide to action. This is not a recommendation to be clever or to calculate well in a narrow sense. It is the commitment to face reality as it is and to think when thinking is required. Never place any value above your own perception of the facts. Rationality is primary because all the other virtues are applications of it to specific domains. Consider what rationality demands in practice. You are in a meeting and your manager proposes a plan you believe will fail. The evidence points clearly toward a flaw, but the room is enthusiastic. Rationality requires you to hold the facts above the social pressure. Not to be obnoxious about it, but to refuse to blank out what you know, because blanking out is easier than confronting it. Independence is the virtue of relying on your own judgment as your primary guide, not in the sense that you never learn from others, but in the sense that you evaluate what others say rather than accepting it on authority. The independent person does not substitute a teacher's conclusion for their own thinking. They check the reasoning, examine the evidence, and accept only what their own mind finds warranted. Rand saw the opposite as second-handedness. That is living through the judgments and approval of others rather than through one's own understanding. Integrity is the virtue of loyalty to one's convictions in action. It means practicing what you have concluded is true. Not splitting your life into what you believe and what you do. A person of integrity does not hold one set of principles in theory and violate them when convenient. The point is not rigidity. It is consistency between thought and action, so that your life is an integrated whole. Honesty is the refusal to fake reality. Rand meant more than not telling lies to other people. She meant the refusal to pretend, to yourself or to anyone, that things are other than they are. This includes refusing to fake competence you lack, emotions you do not feel, or knowledge you do not possess. The honest person does not try to gain a value by creating a false impression of reality. To do so would be to declare that reality is not on your side and that you need to replace it with an invention. Justice is the virtue of evaluating people and treating them as they deserve, based on the facts of who they are and what they have done. Rand's concept of justice is not about redistribution or social equity in the modern sense. It is about accuracy of moral judgment. You observe what a person does, evaluate it rationally, and respond accordingly. You do not condemn the innocent or excuse the guilty. You do not pretend that a person's character is other than what their actions reveal. Productiveness is the virtue of creating the material values that sustain your life through rational work. For Rand, productive work is not merely a means to an income. It is the central purpose of a rational life, the activity through which a person exercises their highest capacities and makes their existence concrete. The producer transforms ideas into reality. The scientist, the engineer, the entrepreneur, the artist who brings a vision into material form. Rand saw parasitism, whether economic or intellectual, as a fundamental betrayal of human nature. Pride is the virtue of moral ambitiousness. Rand did not mean vanity or boastfulness. She meant the commitment to making oneself worthy of happiness through deliberate effort. A proud person treats their own moral character as a project requiring active construction, not something that happens by default. They hold themselves to standards and take responsibility when they fall short. Not through guilt, but through a refusal to settle for less than their best. Tara Smith, in her scholarly treatment of Rand's normative ethics, has argued these virtues function as an integrated system. Rationality is the root from which the others branch. Independence is rationality applied to the question of cognitive authority. Integrity is rationality applied to the relation between belief and action. Honesty is rationality applied to one's dealings with facts in a social context. Justice is rationality applied to evaluating other people. Productiveness is rationality applied to creating values. Pride is rationality directed at the project of one's own moral character. Each virtue is not an independent duty, but a specific form of the commitment to thinking and acting in accordance with reality. Remove any one, and the others become unstable. A person who is honest but not independent will tell the truth only when the group approves. A person who is productive but not just will work hard while ignoring the moral character of their collaborators. The virtues hold together because they are all expressions of a single underlying orientation. That orientation is toward the facts. Critics have raised several concerns. One is that the derivation of specific virtues from the standard of life is more asserted than argued. Why these 7 and not others? Rand gave relatively little systematic justification for treating this particular list as exhaustive. Another concern is that the virtues seem most naturally suited to a specific type of life, the life of an independent creative professional in a modern capitalist society. Whether they capture the full range of human excellence is an open question. A deeper objection targets the relationship between virtue and self-interest. Rand insisted that the virtuous life is always in the long run in the agent's self-interest. But many philosophers argue real moral dilemmas exist where virtue conflicts with personal well-being. A whistleblower who exposes corporate fraud may act with perfect integrity and honesty, and still lose their career, savings, and social standing. Rand would likely say the whistleblower is acting in their genuine long-term interest. A life sustained by complicity and fraud is not a truly human life. Whether that response is a deep truth or a definitional maneuver is one of the harder questions in objectivist ethics. Part 10. Against Altruism. Rand's attack on altruism is the most widely known and most widely misunderstood element of her philosophy. The misunderstanding begins with the word itself. In common usage, altruism means being kind, generous, or considerate of others. Rand was not against any of these things. She used the word in its original philosophical sense, coined by Auguste Comte in the 19th century. Comte defined altruism as the moral obligation to live for the sake of others. Not kindness as a choice, sacrifice as a duty. The distinction between benevolence and altruism is load-bearing in Rand's ethics. Benevolence is goodwill toward others, flowing from one's own values. You help a friend because you value the friendship. You donate to a cause because it advances something you care about. These are expressions of self-interest properly understood. The value you receive, whether emotional or practical, is part of your life. Altruism, in the Comtean sense Rand targeted, is different. It holds that the moral worth of an action increases in proportion to the sacrifice involved. If helping someone costs you nothing, the act has little moral significance. If it costs you greatly, even costs you your life, it is the highest moral act. The more you lose, the more moral you are. Rand found this principle not just wrong, but destructive. Her argument runs through several steps. First, if the standard of morality is self-sacrifice, then your own life and happiness have no moral status. They become things to be given away, not pursued. Your goals matter only insofar as others benefit from them. This means the person most in accord with the altruistic ideal is someone who has nothing left, who has given everything away. The ideal moral agent, on a strict reading of the principle, is empty. Second, altruism cannot be practiced universally without contradiction. If everyone's duty is to sacrifice for others, then everyone is simultaneously a sacrificer and a beneficiary. Person A gives up their values for person B. Person B is supposed to give up their values for person A. The system runs in circles. Nobody is permitted to enjoy the values being produced, because enjoying them would be selfish. Third, and this is where the argument connects to politics, Rand claimed altruism provides the moral cover for every collectivist system in history. If individuals exist to serve others, then someone must decide which others and how much service. That role falls to the state, the church, the collective, or whoever claims to represent the greater good. The individual who objects is told they are being selfish. And since selfishness has been defined as the worst moral failing, the objection is silenced before it begins. Rand saw this pattern repeating across very different political systems. The Soviet Union demanded sacrifice for the proletariat. Fascism demanded sacrifice for the nation. The welfare state, in Rand's view, demands sacrifice for society through taxation and redistribution. The particular recipient changes, the underlying moral demand does not. Give up what is yours for a claim that is not yours, and feel guilty if you resist. There are strong objections to this picture. The most immediate is that Rand's definition of altruism is a straw man relative to how most ethical traditions use the concept. Consequentialists do not demand sacrifice for its own sake. They want to maximize total well-being, which includes the agent's own. Kantians demand that you treat others as ends in themselves, but this does not require self-destruction. Virtue ethicists like Aristotle consider generosity a virtue, but generosity properly practiced comes from abundance, not self-annihilation. Rand's defenders respond that the problem is not with moderate or qualified altruism in practice, it is with the underlying principle. Once you accept that your moral duty is defined by others' needs rather than your own rational values, you have surrendered the foundation. How much sacrifice is demanded becomes a matter of degree, not of kind. And the degree tends to escalate because there is no principled stopping point. There is always another need, another claim, another demand. Nira Badwa, a philosopher sympathetic to many of Rand's conclusions, has argued that Rand's account of altruism is too binary. Most real moral decisions are not choices between pure self-interest and pure self-sacrifice. They involve complex webs of attachment, love, and mutual benefit. A parent who sacrifices sleep to care for a sick child is not acting against self-interest in any meaningful sense. The child's well-being is part of the parent's values. Rand would agree with this in principle, but Badwa argues the theoretical framework does not accommodate it gracefully. The language of selfishness versus altruism flattens a landscape that is richer than the dichotomy allows. Part 11. Rights, Government, and the Moral Case for Capitalism. Most defences of capitalism are economic. They argue that free markets produce more wealth, more innovation, and more efficient allocation of resources than the alternatives. Rand considered these arguments true but insufficient. She believed capitalism needed a moral defence, not just a utilitarian one. And she believed no one had provided it. Her argument starts with the concept of individual rights. A right, for Rand, is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a person's freedom of action in a social context. The key word is action. Rights are not entitlements to things. They are freedoms to act without interference from others. The right to life does not mean someone must keep you alive. It means no one may take your life by force. The right to property does not mean you are guaranteed possessions. It means no one may seize what you have earned. This distinction between negative rights and positive rights is central to Rand's politics. Negative rights require only that others refrain from initiating force against you. Positive rights require that others provide you with something, whether food, healthcare, education, or housing. Rand rejected positive rights entirely. She argued that a right to healthcare, for instance, means someone must be compelled to provide it. That compulsion violates the provider's rights. One person's positive right is another person's enforced obligation. All rights in Rand's framework derive from a single foundational right, the right to life. Because human survival requires the exercise of reason, and reason cannot function under coercion, life requires freedom. The right to life implies the right to act on your own judgment. That implies the right to keep the products of your effort. That is the right to property. Property rights are not a separate principle. They are the right to life in its material expression. From rights, Rand derived her theory of government. Government exists for one purpose only: to protect individual rights by retaliating against those who initiate physical force. Police protect citizens from criminals. The military protects citizens from foreign aggressors. Courts resolve disputes according to objective law. That is the full scope of legitimate government. Any government function beyond this is, on Rand's view, an act of force against its own citizens. Taxation to fund welfare programs takes property without consent. Regulation of business restricts freedom of action without a rights violation having occurred. Licensing requirements prevent people from exercising their right to work. Rand advocated what she called laissez-faire capitalism, a social system where the government's sole function is the protection of rights. No regulation of trade, no redistribution of wealth, no government involvement in education, science or the economy. This is where Rand diverges even from most libertarians and classical liberals. She did not defend capitalism as a pragmatic arrangement that happens to produce good outcomes. She defended it as the only moral social system, the only system consistent with the nature of human beings as rational individuals with rights. Any mixed economy, any compromise between freedom and government control is, on her view, an unstable contradiction. It preserves the form of rights while undermining their content. The objections are numerous and serious. Political philosophers across the spectrum have challenged the coherence of a purely negative rights framework. If the right to life means anything substantive, critics argue, it must include some minimal conditions for exercising that right. A person dying of a preventable disease in a wealthy society has the formal freedom to act on their own judgment. But without access to treatment, that freedom is hollow. Rand would reply that compelling someone to provide treatment violates the provider's rights. The solution is not coercion, but voluntary action. Charity, mutual aid, and the general prosperity created by a free market will address the needs that government programs currently address, without the moral cost of force. Critics find this response insufficient. They argue that historical evidence shows markets alone do not reliably provide for those unable to compete. A different line of criticism questions whether Rand's account of rights is adequately grounded. Matthew Zwolinski has argued that Rand's theory of rights faces at least three serious problems. The derivation from the requirements of survival to a principle of absolute non-initiation of force involves steps that are not fully justified. Why must the right to act on one's judgment be absolute rather than prima facie? Why does the prohibition on force extend as far as Rand claims and no further? And can a theory grounded in individual survival generate obligations to respect others' rights without smuggling in a social principle that the theory officially denies? These remain live questions. Rand's moral case for capitalism has enormous rhetorical power and a clear logical structure. Whether that structure bears the full weight she placed on it is a different matter. Part 12. The Trader Principle and the Harmony of Interests. Rand's ethics is often caricatured as a license for predation. The strong take what they want and call it rational self-interest. This is close to the opposite of what she actually argued. The predator, the fraud, the looter, these are her villains, not her heroes. The key to understanding why lies in what Rand called the trader principle. Rational people relate to one another through voluntary exchange, each offering value for value. Not sacrifice, not exploitation. Trade in the broadest sense, encompassing material goods, intellectual exchange, emotional connection, and love. A trader does not seek the unearned. A trader does not demand that others give up their values. A trader offers something of value and receives something of value in return. This extends to every form of human relationship Rand considered legitimate. Friendship is a trade of values. You choose friends because of who they are, because their character and achievements are things you admire and enjoy. They choose you for the same reason. Love, for Rand, is the most intense form of this recognition. You love someone because they embody the values you hold highest. Not out of duty, not out of need. Not out of pity. Out of a response to real qualities you have identified and evaluated. This is where Rand makes a bold claim that much of the tradition would resist. She argued there is no genuine conflict of interests among rational people. The reasoning goes like this. If all parties in a relationship are pursuing rational values, and rational values are grounded in the requirements of human life, then each person's interests align with the interests of every other rational person. Consider two scientists working in the same field. A zero-sum view says they are competitors for a limited number of grants, positions, and publications. Rand's view says they are allies. Each one's discoveries increase the total body of knowledge from which both benefit. Their rational interest is in truth, and truth is not a finite resource that one person's gain removes from another. The harmony thesis depends on a crucial qualifier. It holds only for rational people acting on rational values. If someone pursues irrational values, say power over others or unearned wealth, then conflicts do arise. But Rand classified those conflicts as the result of irrationality, not of self-interest, properly understood. The criminal's interests conflict with the honest person's, but the criminal is not pursuing genuine self-interest. They are pursuing destruction, which ultimately destroys them as well. This is philosophically ambitious and faces real pressure. Economists and game theorists have documented situations where individually rational choices lead to collectively bad outcomes. The prisoner's dilemma, the tragedy of the commons, and free rider problems all describe cases where rational agents pursuing their own interests can harm one another and themselves. Rand's defenders argue these scenarios assume a narrow, short-term definition of rationality. A truly rational person, one who thinks in principles rather than range-of-the-moment calculations, recognizes that cooperation and honesty serve long-term interests better than defection. Reputation, trust, and the benefits of a functioning social order are all self-interested reasons to cooperate. Critics counter that this works only in conditions Rand assumed, but did not justify. Repeated interactions, transparent behavior, and functioning legal systems. In one-shot encounters or conditions of anonymity, the rational egoist's incentive to defect remains, and the claim that all apparent conflicts among rational people are really misidentifications of rational interest risks becoming unfalsifiable. Whenever interest conflict, the objectivist can simply declare one party irrational. The harmony of interests is then true by definition rather than by observation. Part 13. Romantic Realism and the Philosophy of Art. Rand took aesthetics as seriously as she took ethics or epistemology. For most philosophers, art is a secondary topic. For Rand, it was indispensable to human survival in a specific and precise way. Her theory of art begins with a cognitive problem. Human beings think in abstractions. The principles by which a person lives, their convictions about what is true, what is possible, what matters, are all abstract. But human experience is concrete. You do not experience justice in the abstract. You experience a particular situation where justice is at stake. The gap between abstract principles and concrete daily life is always present and always pressing. Art closes this gap. It takes abstract ideas about human life and makes them perceptible in concrete form. A novel shows you what a principled person looks like when they act. Not a definition of integrity, but a character embodying integrity in a particular situation with specific details. Music, Rand argued, concretizes a person's fundamental emotional experience of life, though her account of how it does so remained less developed than her theory of literature. This function is not decorative, it is a cognitive necessity. A person needs to see their abstractions made real, to experience in perception what they have grasped only in thought. Art provides what Rand called a concretization of metaphysical abstractions. It shows you what a world shaped by your deepest convictions would look like. Rand introduced the concept of a sense of life to explain how art communicates. A sense of life is a person's implicit emotionally held view of the nature of existence and their place in it. It is not a philosophy. It is a pre-conceptual equivalent of a philosophy, an emotional orientation that shapes how a person responds to the world before any explicit reasoning takes place. Some people feel, at a deep level, that the universe is open to achievement and that human effort matters. Others feel the universe is hostile and that effort is futile. These orientations shape what kind of art resonates with a person and what kind they create. Rand classified art movements according to their implicit view of human nature and existence. Naturalism presents the world as it statistically is, recording events without selection for meaning. Rand found this approach philosophically empty. It abdicates the artist's essential task, which is to present the world as it could be and ought to be. Romanticism, in Rand's usage, is the school that treats human volition as real and consequential. Romantic art shows characters choosing, acting, and facing the results of their choices. The plot is driven by values in conflict, and the outcome depends on what the characters do. This is the school Rand allied herself with. Her own position, which she called romantic realism, combined romantic volition with a realistic treatment of the concrete world. She rejected fantasy and allegory as evasions of the real. The proper subject of art is this world, this life, presented in a way that reveals what is possible to human beings. Her heroes, Howard Rourke and John Galt, exist in recognizable settings and face real-world problems. They are idealized, not by being placed in magical circumstances, but by being shown acting with full rational consistency in ordinary ones. Rand held that aesthetic judgments are objective, not in the sense that everyone should like the same art, but that the quality of a work can be evaluated by rational standards. Technical skill is objectively accessible. The coherence of a work's theme, whether its parts serve a unified vision, is objectively accessible. And the metaphysical worldview a work embodies can be evaluated against what is true about human nature and existence. This last claim is the most controversial. Most aestheticians today would reject the idea that art can be evaluated based on its philosophical content. A technically brilliant work expressing pessimism about human nature would, on Rand's view, be flawed at the deepest level, however skilled its execution. This seems to many critics to confuse moral evaluation with aesthetic evaluation. A painting can be magnificent regardless of whether its worldview aligns with Rand's convictions about human potential. Rand's defenders argue the objection misses the point. Art is not a neutral container that can hold any content equally well. Because art functions as a concretization of metaphysical values, its content is not separable from its artistic achievement. A work that embodies a false view of human nature cannot fully succeed as art, even if it succeeds as craft. Whether this argument persuades depends on whether you accept the functional theory of art it rests on. If art exists primarily to concretize abstractions about human life, then philosophical content matters to aesthetic value. If art serves other or broader functions, the argument does not hold. Part 14. Rand and the Philosophical Tradition. Rand positioned herself as heir to one philosopher, an adversary of most of the rest. The heir was Aristotle. The adversary list was long, but the main targets were Plato, Kant, Hegel, and the various forms of skepticism, mysticism, and collectivism she saw them as generating. Her debt to Aristotle was genuine and specific. From Aristotle she took the law of identity, the commitment to this worldly reality, the grounding of knowledge in sense perception, the idea that ethics derives from human nature, and the connection between virtue and flourishing. She considered Aristotle the greatest philosopher who ever lived, and she thought the history of philosophy since Aristotle was largely a history of regression from his insights. But the relationship was not simple inheritance. Rand rejected Aristotle's metaphysical biology, his belief in intrinsic final causes, his acceptance of slavery as natural, and his view of the state as prior to the individual. She kept his general orientation while stripping away what she considered his errors and building her own system on the cleaned foundation. Her relationship to the empiricist tradition is more complex than she acknowledged. Rand insisted that all knowledge begins in sense perception, that there are no innate ideas, and that the mind processes sensory data through a specific method. This is structurally similar to the British empiricist programme running from Locke through Hume, but she rejected where the empiricists ended up. Hume's skepticism about causation, induction, and the self were, for Rand, symptoms of a flawed theory of concepts, not genuine philosophical discoveries. The empiricists started from the senses but lacked a theory of abstraction that could get them from percepts to reliable knowledge. The pragmatists, William James and John Dewey, received special scorn. Rand saw pragmatism as the philosophy that abandoned truth in favour of workability. If there is no objective reality to be right about, then ideas are just tools, evaluated by their practical consequences. Rand viewed this as the destruction of philosophy's core purpose. If truth is just what works, then any idea is as good as any other, so long as it produces the right outcomes. That opens the door to manipulation, propaganda, and the subordination of thought to power. Existentialism was another target. Rand shared with the existentialists a concern for individual authenticity, choice, and the dangers of conformity. But she rejected their conclusions almost entirely. Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence meant for him that there is no human nature to ground moral claims. Rand held the opposite. Human nature exists, is knowable, and is the foundation of everything ethics requires. The existentialist emphasis on anxiety, absurdity, and the groundlessness of values was, for Rand, the predictable result of accepting Kantian premises about the limits of knowledge. The relationship to the Austrian School of Economics is real and documented, though Rand was not an economist. She knew Ludwig von Mises and admired his defence of free markets. She read Henry Hazlitt and was influenced by Isabel Patterson's political philosophy, but she disagreed with Mises on fundamental philosophical issues. Mises was a utilitarian who defended capitalism on the grounds that it produces the best outcomes for the most people. Rand rejected this approach. She argued capitalism is just because it respects individual rights, regardless of whether it maximizes aggregate welfare. Her relationship to libertarianism was hostile despite the obvious overlap in political conclusions. Rand called libertarians right-wing hippies and refused to be associated with the movement. Her objection was philosophical, not merely personal. She argued libertarians try to defend freedom without a philosophical foundation. They borrow their politics from Rand, but reject the metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics that justify it. Without those foundations, she claimed, libertarianism is an arbitrary preference for freedom that cannot withstand serious challenge. This criticism has an ironic dimension. The libertarian movement draws more from Rand than from any other single thinker. Her novels have been cited by politicians, economists, and public intellectuals as formative influences. Yet the movement she most inspired is the one she most vocally disowned. Part 15. The Critiques. Rand's philosophy has faced criticism from virtually every direction in the philosophical landscape. From analytic philosophers, continental philosophers, Kantians, consequentialists, libertarians sympathetic to her conclusions, and Aristotelians sympathetic to her method. The critiques vary in quality and seriousness. Some are dismissals based on unfamiliarity with the actual arguments. Others engage the system at its strongest points and identify real difficulties. The most technically influential critique remains Robert Nozick's 1971 essay on the Randian argument. We covered its central point earlier. Nozick argued that Rand's derivation of ethics from the concept of life fails to close the is-ought gap. The argument shows that if you choose to live, reason can tell you how. It does not show you are rationally required to choose life. Douglas Den Uyl and Douglas Rasmussen published a detailed response in 1978, arguing that Nozick misread key passages and failed to engage Rand's concept formation on its own terms. The exchange established the basic structure of the debate that continues today. Michael Huemer's critique, published on different occasions and in different forms, goes further in several directions. On the ethical argument, Huemer identified what he considers a systematic equivocation on the word life. The argument begins with biological survival, moves to distinctly human rational life, and arrives at something closer to flourishing. Each shift changes the content of what is being defended without announcing the change. If the standard is biological survival, the ethics becomes ruthlessly practical in ways that clash with Rand's actual moral positions. If the standard is flourishing, the derivation from bare biological facts becomes much harder to sustain. Huemer also challenged Rand's first premise, the claim that value is necessarily agent-relative. Rand treated this as obvious, but it begs the question against moral realists who hold that some things are good absolutely, not just relative to a particular organism. If it is simply good that rational beings exist, regardless of any particular agent's stake in the matter, then Rand's entire derivation from the agent-relative nature of value does not get started. Eric Mack, in his essay Problematic Arguments in Randian Ethics, developed what many consider the most careful internal critique. He examined the steps of Rand's ethical argument with precision and identified specific logical gaps. Where Rand claimed one conclusion followed from her premises, Mack showed that additional assumptions, not always stated, were required to make the inference work. His critique is especially significant because it comes from a philosopher sympathetic to Rand's broad conclusions. A separate line of criticism targets Rand's epistemology. The theory of measurement omission is original, but its critics argue it does not solve the problem of universals as completely as Rand believed. The Stanford Encyclopedia notes that Rand's insistence that everything is particular raises an unresolved question. What grounds the commensurability of attributes across particulars, if not some form of universal? Rand's response, that the commensurable attributes are real features of real things, seems to presuppose the very thing the theory of concepts was meant to explain. Some critics have noted that Rand's rejection of Kant's distinction between the form of cognition and its object is itself reminiscent of Kant. Rand distinguished between the content of awareness, which comes from reality, and the form of awareness, which is the method by which the mind processes that content. This is structurally parallel to Kant's distinction between the matter of experience and the forms the mind contributes. Whether the parallel is superficial or deep is debated, but it is a tension that critics have identified. On the political front, the objections cluster around several problems. The non-initiation of force principle, which Rand treated as absolute, faces difficulties at its boundaries. Is pollution a form of force? Is market manipulation? Is allowing someone to die when you could easily save them a violation of their rights? Rand's framework gives a clear answer: no, only physical force or fraud count. But many find the framework too rigid to handle the complexity of real social life. The problem of initial acquisition of property has also been raised. Rand's theory of rights assumes people have legitimate property and government exists to protect it. But how does legitimate property come into existence in the first place? If you claim a tract of land, on what basis is that claim justified? Rand did not develop a detailed theory of initial acquisition, and the gap matters because the justice of the entire system depends on the legitimacy of the starting distribution. Finally, the academic critique of Rand's writing style and argumentative method deserves mention because it has had a real effect on her reception. Professional philosophers have noted that Rand often argued by dramatic scenario, emotional appeal, and binary opposition rather than by careful premise-by-premise reasoning. Her arguments are frequently embedded in novels and essays rather than presented in the standard philosophical format. This does not mean the arguments are bad. It does mean they are harder to evaluate, and it has contributed to the widespread refusal of academic philosophers to engage with her seriously. Part 16. The Defences. The strongest defences of Rand's philosophy have emerged not from popular advocates, but from academic philosophers who have worked to formalize, extend, and repair the arguments. Their efforts address the specific critiques just outlined and represent the most developed version of objectivism currently available. On the is-ought gap, the most sophisticated defense comes from the neo-Aristotelian wing of objectivist scholarship. Douglas Den Uyl and Douglas Rasmussen have argued in multiple works that the gap only appears unbridgeable if you accept a Humean framework about what facts are. If facts are value-neutral descriptions of a meaningless world, then no amount of them will generate an obligation. But if some facts are inherently normative, specifically facts about what living organisms require to function as the kind of entity they are, then the gap was never real. A plant's need for sunlight is simultaneously a fact and a standard. It is what the plant requires, which is both a description and a criterion for evaluation. This line of argument connects Rand to the broader neo-Aristotelian tradition in ethics, which includes Philippa Foot and Alasdair MacIntyre, though neither endorsed Rand's conclusions. Foot argued in Natural Goodness that evaluations of living things are a species of natural fact. A wolf with bad legs is defective in the same factual sense that a calculation with an error is defective. The standard is set by what the organism is, by its life form. If this move works for wolves, Rand's defenders argue, it works for human beings. And the specific requirements of human life as the life of a rational animal generate the specific content of ethics. On the equivocation between survival and flourishing, Tara Smith's work represents the fullest attempt at resolution. Smith argues the apparent tension dissolves when you understand life as an ongoing process of self-sustaining action. Life is not mere persistence of biological function. It is the continuous activity of maintaining and advancing one's existence through the exercise of one's characteristic capacities. For a human being, that activity is rational thought expressed in purposeful action. Survival and flourishing are not two different standards, but two aspects of a single process. A person who merely persists biologically while abandoning rational purpose is not fully alive in the sense relevant to ethics. Critics find this response promising, but question whether it fully escapes the problem. The move from biological life to life as a process of rational self-sustaining action carries a normative weight that needs its own justification. Why is the rational life the standard rather than, say, the longest possible life or the most pleasurable life? Smith's answer is that rationality is the defining characteristic of human life. But defining already involves a normative selection. What counts as defining and why are precisely the questions at issue. On the theory of concepts, Alan Gotthelf and Gregory Salmieri in A Companion to Ayn Rand provided the most rigorous recent presentation of measurement omission. They emphasized that Rand's theory is not a traditional realist account that locates a universal in the objects. Nor is it a nominalist account that treats concepts as mere labels. It occupies a distinctive middle position where concepts are objective cognitive products of a real process applied to real attributes of real things. The concept is objective because the process tracks features of reality, and it is a human product because the cognitive method of omitting measurements is an act of the mind. The defense of Rand's political philosophy has taken two main forms. Tara Smith, in Moral Rights and Political Freedom, and others have worked to show that the derivation of rights from the requirements of life is tighter than critics acknowledge. The argument is not simply that force is unpleasant. It is that the initiation of force negates the mind's ability to function as the survival organ of a rational being. Force substitutes the attacker's judgment for the victim's. Because reason is the means of human survival, force is directly life-threatening, not as a contingent matter, but as a matter of principle. On the broader question of academic reception, the work of the Ayn Rand Society within the American Philosophical Association has represented a sustained effort to bring Rand's ideas into mainstream scholarly dialogue. Since 1987, the Society has held sessions at APA meetings and published volumes through the University of Pittsburgh Press. The Ayn Rand Society Philosophical Studies series has featured contributions from both objectivist scholars and outside commentators, including critical ones. The Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, a peer-reviewed interdisciplinary journal, has also published philosophical work engaging her ideas from multiple angles. These efforts have not transformed the profession's overall assessment of Rand, but they have established a body of serious work that anyone evaluating the philosophy honestly should engage with. The best objectivist scholarship today is more precise, more responsive to objections, and more connected to the broader philosophical literature than Rand's own writings were. Whether those refinements are enough to resolve the structural difficulties is the question the next generation of scholarship must answer. Part 17. The Movement and its Fractures. Philosophical systems sometimes remain purely academic. Objectivism did not. It became a movement with institutions, leaders, orthodoxies and schisms that illuminate something important about the relationship between philosophy and the people who adopt it. During Rand's lifetime, the movement centered on her personality. In the 1960s, Nathaniel Branden, her closest associate and the founder of the Nathaniel Branden Institute, delivered lectures that brought objectivism to thousands of students across the country. The relationship ended in 1968 in a dramatic personal and intellectual break. Rand publicly denounced Branden, and Branden was excommunicated from the movement entirely. The details involved a romantic relationship between them that had ended badly, but the pattern it established, personal loyalty as a condition of intellectual standing, would recur. After Rand's death in 1982, leadership passed to Leonard Peikoff, her designated intellectual heir. Peikoff founded the Ayn Rand Institute in 1985 and made a fateful philosophical decision. He declared objectivism a closed system. This meant the fundamental principles were those Rand herself stated. New applications and implications could be drawn, but the core principles could not be revised, reinterpreted or challenged from within while still calling the result objectivism. In 1989, David Kelly, an academic philosopher affiliated with the Ayn Rand Institute, delivered a lecture to a libertarian group. This was considered a breach of orthodoxy because Rand had explicitly condemned the libertarian movement. Peikoff wrote a long essay titled Fact and Value, arguing that moral judgment of other people's ideas is not optional in objectivism. To associate with those who hold fundamentally wrong ideas is to sanction their errors. Kelly was expelled from the Institute. Kelly responded by founding the Institute for Objectivist Studies, later renamed the Atlas Society. He published Truth and Toleration, arguing for what he called an open system approach to objectivism. Philosophy, Kelly argued, is not a finished product delivered by a single thinker. It is an ongoing project of inquiry. Objectivism's principles should be treated like scientific theories, open to revision in light of new evidence and new arguments, while retaining their core insights. The open-closed debate is not merely institutional. It raises a genuine philosophical question. Can a philosophy be both systematic and open to revision? Rand built a system where each branch depends on the ones beneath it. If you revise the epistemology, the ethics may need to change. If you revise the ethics, the politics may collapse. Peikoff's argument is that this interdependence makes revision dangerous. Change one load-bearing element and you are no longer doing objectivism. You are doing something else and borrowing the name. Kelly's argument is that refusing revision makes the philosophy a dogma rather than a living intellectual project. A system that cannot incorporate new evidence or correct its own errors has abandoned the commitment to reason that supposedly defines it. If rationality means following the evidence wherever it leads, then declaring certain conclusions immune to evidence is irrational by objectivism's own standard. The parallels to other intellectual movements are instructive. Marxism faced the same problem. Freudian psychoanalysis faced the same problem. Any system built by a charismatic founder who insisted on the system's completeness will eventually confront the question of how to handle disagreement among followers. The pattern of excommunication and schism is not unique to objectivism, but objectivism is a particularly clear case because the philosophy itself explicitly values independence of judgment. The result today is a fractured landscape. The Ayn Rand Institute represents the orthodox position, producing scholarship, educational programs, and public advocacy aligned with Peikoff's reading. The Atlas Society represents the open approach, engaging more broadly with libertarian and classical liberal thought. Independent scholars work outside both institutions, some engaging with the philosophy on its merits, some treating it as a historical phenomenon. The fractures have had a mixed effect on the philosophy's intellectual development. The institutional pressures of orthodoxy have sometimes discouraged the kind of rigorous self-criticism that any philosophy needs. But the competition between factions has also produced more careful scholarship than either side might have generated alone. Each side has an incentive to make the strongest possible case, knowing the other will challenge every weakness. Part 18. What remains alive? The question a serious person asks about any philosophical system is not whether it is perfect. No system is. The question is whether it contains ideas that advance understanding, that survive serious criticism, and that remain productive even when parts of the system fail. Rand's metaphysics, her commitment to objective reality, the primacy of existence, and the law of identity is philosophically mainstream in content, if not always in formulation. Most working scientists and many analytic philosophers share these commitments without calling them objectivism. What Rand added was a systematic articulation of what these commitments entail, and a willingness to follow them into every branch of philosophy. The result is a framework that, at the metaphysical level, generates relatively little controversy among those who accept realism in any form. Her epistemology is more distinctive and more debatable. The theory of measurement omission remains the most original contribution. It has not been widely adopted in mainstream philosophy of mind or epistemology, but neither has it been definitively refuted. The concept of contextual certainty offers a middle path between dogmatism and skepticism that deserves more engagement than it has received. Her attack on the analytic-synthetic distinction, though developed before Quine's more famous assault on the same target, has remained largely within the objectivist literature rather than entering the broader debate. The ethics is where the living arguments are most active. The neo-Aristotelian grounding of value in life, the derivation of virtue from rational self-interest, and the critique of altruism as a moral principle all remain subjects of genuine scholarly dispute. The is-ought question is not settled. The equivocation objection is not settled. The harmony of interest thesis faces empirical and theoretical pressure. But the basic framework that ethics should be grounded in facts about human nature rather than in commands, intuitions or social agreements is shared by a significant and growing body of ethical theory. Rand's political philosophy has had the most visible real-world impact and the most contentious intellectual reception. Her moral case for capitalism remains the most uncompromising version available. It appeals to people precisely because it does not apologize, does not make pragmatic concessions, and does not rest on utilitarian calculations that could, in principle, be turned against freedom. Whether the argument actually works, whether it can sustain absolute rights from the premises Rand offered, remains an open question. But the ambition to ground political freedom in individual rights derived from human nature is alive in contemporary political philosophy, even among thinkers who would not call themselves objectivists. Her aesthetics has been the least influential in academic philosophy, but may contain underexplored resources. The idea that art serves a cognitive function, that it concretizes abstract values in perceivable form, is not unique to Rand, but is formulated with unusual clarity in her work. The concept of sense of life, a preconceptual emotional orientation toward existence, connects to contemporary work on implicit attitudes and affective cognition in ways that have not been fully explored. The broadest legacy is cultural rather than academic. Rand gave millions of people a vocabulary for thinking about individual rights, productive achievement and rational self-interest as moral goods rather than moral failings. Whatever the technical problems with her arguments, the core conviction that your life belongs to you and that living it well is a moral achievement, not a selfish indulgence, has shaped how generations of readers understand themselves. The academic legacy is more complicated. Rand wanted to be taken seriously as a philosopher, and for decades she largely was not. The growing body of scholarly work, from the Ayn Rand Society to the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, represents a change, though a slow one. The best objectivist scholars are now producing work that meets the standards of mainstream academic philosophy. The question is whether the philosophy itself, when subjected to those standards, holds together well enough to merit the attention. An honest assessment says this: the system contains genuine insights, particularly in epistemology and in the grounding of ethics in human nature. It contains serious structural problems, particularly in the derivation of specific moral and political conclusions from those foundations. It contains a vision of human life, of the individual as a rational being whose highest purpose is creative achievement, that resonates with something real in human experience, even when the philosophical scaffolding is strained. The specialist's verdict is not unanimous, and probably never will be. The system is too ambitious, too sweeping, and too entangled with cultural and political commitments for any clean resolution. What remains is a set of arguments that are worth reconstructing, worth testing, and worth engaging with seriously, regardless of where one ends up. The worst response to Rand is the most common one: dismissal without examination. The second worst is uncritical acceptance. Both refuse to do what Rand herself claimed to value most: think.